Hello, welcome back, everybody, and we should be streaming again. Hopefully, you can all rejoin us. And with Professor Alex Vitale, who is the author of The End of Policing, and we were going to talk about Defund the Police. So, Alex, before we cut out, you were just about to talk us through the book and your motivations for the book, presumably.
Yes, well, I was saying, that trying to make the arguments as concrete and practical as possible was definitely one of the primary motivations. I think there had been some work done that laid out some of the principles behind this, but I felt we'd reached a point where I could make some pretty concrete claims about how to produce public safety without all the kind of negative collateral consequences that are built into our reliance on policing. So the book, lays out some historical arguments about the kind of functional history of policing and its role in society that I think indicates why so many of the problems that we see with policing can't be fixed by a whole set of what are ultimately very superficial kind of procedural fixes that kind of tinker around the margins of what are some pretty fundamental injustices built into the model. And then I look at, 10 public safety issues that have motivated a lot of policing, describe why they're a bad idea, the harms that are built into them, and then talk about what we could do instead. And I think that's what, in a way, made it possible to write this book when I wrote it, is the wealth of evidence that is available about what we could do instead. And so the primary argument of the book is that we're not going to be able to just reform our way out of the problems with policing, and that we need to shift as many functions of policing as we possibly can to other kinds of mechanisms for producing public safety. So I'm sure we'll get a chance to talk about some of the specifics.
Yeah, absolutely. Speaking of that, my taxonomy that I came up with sort of while I was reading the book is that I split it into three basic categories, and I'm sure you could do it a different way and add some, or split them further. But there are three main things, right? The first is like legalizing or decriminalizing certain activities, whether that's drugs or sex work, or something else like gangs, for example, which maybe we can talk about. That inherently, almost tautologically, reduces the scope of the police, right? Because then they're no longer doing things. The second is getting police out of spaces that they shouldn't be in. Right, so this is like schools, like police in schools, for instance. Maybe police dealing with homeless people, and police kind of de facto providing mental health services and things like that, right? So getting police out of areas they shouldn't be in. And then the third one, this is the one that everybody jumps to, which should be, in my opinion, probably the only really controversial one, is, okay, there is serious crime, there is violence and all of these things. How do we address those things without the police? So I mean, maybe we could talk about those. I mean, you give the example of you have a chapter on drugs, right? And also you have a chapter on sex work. So, sorry, I was just wondering if you wanted to talk through them. Have I cut out again?
Yeah, you did for just a second.
Oh,
So,
God.
well, let's think about your tripartite structuring for a second. So, interestingly, the most sort of public criticism of the book has been from people who sort of say, well, it has some interesting points, but we still need police, policing works, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So, in other words, they agree with the vast majority of claims, let's say sections 1 and 2 of your tripartite model.
Mm.
But because they don't agree with number 3, then they feel no need to actually support in any way the implementation of 1 and 2. Which just doesn't follow logically, because they just said they actually agree with 1 and 2, but because they disagree with some parts, then the whole project is somehow canceled in their mind. And really what that is just a way of saying we want to retain our reliance on policing, and we're just looking for any weakness in your argument, no matter how thin, to discredit the whole project. And that is an intellectually dishonest way of approaching the issue. So let's say that you're sympathetic to 1 and 2. Well, then let's do 1 and 2. Let's start there. I'm perfectly happy to start there, because I think the arguments are incredibly compelling. And what we're seeing is a lot of cities in the United States are starting to take seriously parts 1 and 2. We've seen this growing movement across the US to legalize marijuana. And in some places, we've actually had movements to decriminalize drugs more broadly. Voters in Oregon, through referenda, voted to decriminalize low-level drug possession and dealing, and to turn it over to public health authorities, much the way Portugal has. We've seen efforts to get the police out of schools. In the last 3 years, over 40 cities have eliminated their school police departments and instead are hiring counselors and restorative justice specialists and people who can provide services for young people in crisis. We've seen a growing number of cities create non-police mental health crisis teams to respond to people in crisis, whether it's mental health, sometimes it includes substance abuse, someone who's experiencing homelessness, etc. So I think in a way we've won those arguments, and we just need some more political will to make that happen. The issue about violence, though, even those concerns have turned out to really be a kind of canard, if you will, that we have a growing body of evidence that shows that, first, policing is incredibly ineffective in addressing violence. Second, that it comes with huge costs. And third, that there are lots of evidence-based practices that we could be embracing that have shown real success in reducing violence without all those negative consequences. And some cities are beginning to take that seriously. The city of Newark, New Jersey, took money out of its police department budget to create an Office of Violence Prevention and Trauma Recovery that directly funds community-based organizations doing peer-to-peer outreach, trauma counseling, job readiness training, etc.
Yeah, okay. So, I mean, it seems like there are quite a lot of methods out there for dealing with violent crime and serious crime of various kinds. I want to take a little bit of a step back, actually, because I'm curious about the evidence surrounding how effectively the police reduce violent crime. So you said it's not clear that they actually do, that they're very effective in doing that. So what does that actually mean? What does this research look like?
So it looks like a few things. So first of all, police spend very little time addressing violent crime. In the US, estimates are between about 2 and 5% of police resources are used having anything to do with what we might consider violent crime. And much of that time is not very productive. Police in the US only solve about 60% of homicides. The vast majority of other kinds of violent crime are never even reported to police. Much that is reported is never really investigated. And estimates are that only about 2% of what we consider violent crime in the US results in some kind of conviction. So the role of the police is actually quite minimal. Most people manage these situations and problems on their own, which is not necessarily the most desirable situation, but this idea that the police are out there getting the bad guys, solving all the violent crime, just turns out not to be true. In addition, proponents of policing will say, well, we did a study. We found a 2% improvement in this when we put 50 cops on a street corner. First of all, most of that stuff doesn't really deal with violent crime. There's a lot of misleading claims there. Also, for every study that they trot out, there are many, many more studies that show no effect, right? So even when police target a particular kind of hotspot or something like that, the results have not been particularly positive. And again, even when they are, it comes with huge costs. Then there's this, how do we measure these costs, right? I mean, policing brings a tremendous amount of violence into the communities in which they operate. Police in the United States are responsible for over 5% of all homicides in the United States and very high levels of other kinds of violence, some of which is actually perpetrated in corrupt ways, and some of it is done through normal policing. Now, some people say, look, if we could just get the police to focus on serious crime and quit worrying about all the little stuff like stop and search, that irritates the public, that involves a lot of people who haven't done anything wrong, then this will provide this huge public benefit, restore public trust in the police, etc. But this is only said by people who don't really understand how policing works. Because how is it that the police go after serious crime? Well, a lot of it involves huge amounts of low-level harassment to generate leads. They arrest large numbers of people on low-level offenses to try to get information from them about who's got the guns, who did this shooting, who's in this gang, how do we get more information into the gang database. And so this idea that the police can just do homicide investigations that doesn't involve all kinds of problematic low-level policing is based on people watching too much television, in which they imagine that violent crime investigations are conducted by criminal investigation divisions that have nothing to do with patrol functions. If that were true, why do we need all these patrol functions anyway? So this sort of fundamental tenet that people support for policing rests on, it turns out to be incredibly thin.
That's really interesting. I mean, it's a funny cultural blind spot, isn't it? I suppose, where that notion of the police just questioning people and what you basically you fairly call harassing people is just accepted, and it does. The first thing that springs into your mind is a television show, right? And the television show is almost invariably on the side of the cop, right? And especially the one who's like a loose cannon who doesn't play by the rules but gets the job done, and that the sort of classic, right? So it is interesting that we do accept that they're allowed to do that, right? And I think it's interesting as an observer in the States, and maybe we can use this as an opportunity to talk about US versus UK and stuff. I think the police in the States seem particularly aggressive in their interactions with citizens, right? That seems to be the case, and it's crazy to me that it's just accepted, because while the UK police definitely have many of the issues you've outlined, their approach to citizens is completely different. And I guess we have to ask the question: why would you allow there to be this organization that is just upfront aggressive and rude, and is perceived to have a degree of power over citizens that we wouldn't accept anywhere else?
Well, I'm not sure I totally accept the premise of your question. I mean, there
Yeah.
are obvious differences between UK and US policing, but
Mm,
if you're a young black person
mm,
in London, in South London, where there's been problems with knife crime, let's say, your experience of policing is not really that different than in the US from what I can tell, talking to young people and people who work with them in these communities. There is a high level of aggressive police behavior, insulting and degrading police behavior, violent police behavior. Uh, Similarly, in the United States, policing is not experienced uniformly.
Mm.
If you are a wealthier, whiter person, if you live in a suburban or rural area and are, an otherwise, middle or upper class person, you experience policing as a service. But if you are a poor person, a person of color in the United States, you are being policed. And you often experience that policing as harassing, degrading, and at times violent. So the degree of violence may be different, the
Mm.
intensity of it, but for heavily policed populations in both countries, this is a very negative experience, which has measurable negative long-term consequences for people in terms of their health, their educational achievements, their economic well-being.
Yeah, that is a completely fair point. And I think the I mean, I did want to ask you a bit about the police outside of the USA, because I think one thing that struck me about this book is that it does focus quite a lot on the USA, doesn't it? And deliberately so, because it's about, it's partly about a kind of movement which sprung up in the USA. But you said that you're, as a perhaps a person of color, or a lower income person, or just somebody who's maybe previously committed crimes, your experience of the police is going to be very different to those from the middle class, and especially those from the upper class. Would you say that that is a lesson that you can generalize, to police forces across the world?
Yes, I think it is. So the book is definitely US focused. I mean, I felt like I had data for the US to make certain kinds of claims that I didn't have for other places, and you have to draw some line
I,
somewhere. Though there are lots of international examples
Mm.
in the book that I draw from that
We
show
have a
that
we have
people,
a similar issue in economics as well. It's like, if you want to
yes,
make
of course.
the best data is from the US, that's just it, right?
Yes, yes. And so we do need to be asking tough questions about the generalizability of our findings. And policing does look different in different places and is, in a way, a reflection of larger political and economic realities. So I think that's important. But what I found looking at the development of modern policing over the last 200 or so years was remarkably consistent in the sense that policing emerges in a moment of crisis when there is a need to manage the consequences of regimes of extreme exploitation. So, those primary regimes of extreme exploitation that we see in the late 18th and early 19th centuries are slavery, colonialism, and the rise of mass industrialization. And invariably, we see one or more of these systems of exploitation that give rise to a crisis that leads directly to the creation of policing. And so, my claim is that the function of policing is to manage formal and informal resistance to systems of exploitation. And that's why the burden of it falls more harshly on those who have been historically at the losing end of those arrangements, those who've been enslaved, colonized, or
Mm.
forced into a kind of second class industrial status, or a kind of lumpen proletariat who've been almost completely divorced from participation in the mainstream labor markets. And of course, all of these processes historically have been racialized, so that the burden of these systems of exploitation has always fallen hardest on those who've been racialized as non-white.
Yeah, I mean, you actually start the book by talking about your experience working with homelessness, right, in the States, and how that exposure to a group of, you say people who were at kind of the losing end, or the hard end of the existing socioeconomic system, are much more likely to be exposed to police, and homeless people are, through through moving on, and all the various practices the police engage in. So could you maybe speak a little bit to that?
Sure. So, I didn't go to school to study policing. My undergraduate degree was in, urban public policy, essentially. And so I was working at the San Francisco Coalition on Homelessness not long after college, doing housing and policy and economic development work, and trying to figure out what it would take to increase the availability of housing for people who've been left out of the global economy. And what happened, this is the late 80s and early 90s, was that the city of San Francisco, like many cities, basically gave up on this idea that they were going to house people, and increasingly turned the problem over to the police to manage. And this is a kind of, I think, a central insight that has guided my work ever since, which is this kind of inherent connection between neoliberal austerity and repressive policing, which is that policing becomes necessary when the state has no plan to address fundamental social problems that are a result of the kind of economic systems of exploitation that it has helped put in place. So rather than intervening in housing markets and creating real social housing, rather than creating widespread health guarantees to make sure people have access to mental health services and substance abuse services, etc., we've invested in policing to manage these so-called suspect populations at great public expense, and at great expense to the lives and well-being of those who've been subjected to this. So, we don't, in a way, we don't have mass industrialization in the US anymore. What we have is austerity and globalization, which has just left huge numbers of people out of formal labor markets, and they have turned to informal black markets of drugs and sex work and stolen goods, and living rough and managing as best they can. And those have become the problems for police to manage. And the degree to which they're successful in managing those, these systems of neoliberal austerity can keep chugging along and creating more and more wealth inequality.
And it's interesting, isn't it? Because it's the USA is well known for, among rich countries, having a relatively thin social safety net, and also for having quite an aggressive police force, right, and a lot of incarceration, mass incarceration, and everything. And what you're saying is basically these two things are not a coincidence, right? If you don't have the social safety net, then you're going to need, I'll put need in inverted commas there, the police, in order to manage the people who are in poverty, who are unemployed, who just bear the brunt of of capitalism, essentially.
Yes, and that's why we have this situation where we have all these big city American mayors, often people of color, who remain completely committed to a system of mass policing because they have no plan to address homelessness. They have no plan to address youth unemployment. They have no intention of widely broadening access to health care. And so they need policing to keep a lid on the populations who are being failed by that politics. Until we break this kind of bipartisan consensus in support of tax breaks for the rich and austerity for everyone else, we're going to be burdened with a system of intensive and invasive policing.
Is it the case that countries, if you've looked, I don't know if you've looked at this, countries that tend to have more generous social safety nets, perhaps more equal income distributions, and so on. I mean, Scandinavian countries are the obvious ones that spring to mind. Do they tend to have smaller police forces? Do they tend to have, less invasive laws? Do they tend to have fewer people in prison and so on?
So it's not a simple one-to-one correspondence here, but yes, in general terms, policing in countries with more robust social safety nets tends to be less violent, less intensive, and less invasive. Now, some of them have high counts of police officers, but that doesn't come with the same levels of kind of violence and mass arrests that we see in the States and unfortunately increasingly in the UK.
Okay, okay. And are there any examples of countries where it's kind of gone from one situation to the other? If you know what I mean. So either there was a very strong social safety net and there were few police, to, the social safety net was dismantled and then you saw a rise in policing, or the other way around. Can you see that
Yeah,
transformation in
well,
any cases?
in the UK, we can see this, right? Now that there was austerity for the police. So in a sense, we haven't seen this like radical increase in head counts, but what we have seen is the expansion of policing into more and more arenas of everyday life. So we see more and more police involvement in schools in the UK. I just did an event at London South Bank a few weeks ago where we spent part of a day talking with local advocates and academics about this expansion of policing into schools and how harmful it is. We see police more and more involved in managing the lives of people who are unhoused, people who are having a mental health crisis. And frankly, even the police are not happy about this. They don't really want to be in the homelessness and mental health business. They see this as a burden that has been placed on them due to a set of political failures. And so I think that is the way to understand it. The police did not create these problems. They've been, in a way, left holding the bag. That is the result of a set of political failures.
Mm. Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, one of the clever things you do throughout the book is, I mean, it's clever and it's also good evidence, but it's rhetorically clever too. Is you quote quite a lot of police chiefs, don't you? Basically just almost echoing your argument, saying, we don't want to do all of these things that we haven't been trained to do, which I thought was really, really interesting. And I when I speak to police occasionally in the UK, it's not uncommon for them to say something like, I think drugs should be legal, for example. It's a pretty common opinion among police, right?
Yes. I've been a police scholar for decades. I've worked with police around the world. I've ridden around in the back of police cars in the UK and know many police officials in the UK. So, despite the title, it's not intended as an attack on police as individuals.
Mm.
It's really about a set of political failures. And yes, there are many police who understand and are very sympathetic to many of the arguments that I make. We have here in the States a group, the Law Enforcement Action Project, that used to be called Law Enforcement Against Prohibition, that favors, getting police out of the drug war, out of the vice business, turning over problems in schools, mental health, homelessness to someone other than police. So I think there's a lot of police who are sympathetic to these ideas.
So on the other hand, there must be some resistance, right? Because I suppose if you are talking about defunding the police, ultimately you are talking about police departments that have less funding, obviously, less prestige, less political power, and so on. So I mean, how do you see that versus the level of agreement with you, and how do you think we manage and overcome those challenges?
Yeah, well, if you're a police commander, police chief, something like that, police commissioner, yeah, you don't want your budget cut. So I run into this with some frequency. These police chiefs who are like, who basically have to admit that they should not be doing a bunch of things, but they're always keen to point out, but we shouldn't have our budget cut because we need to expand into these areas and we're overwhelmed as it is, right? Then you also have the kind of police unions. The police unions live and die on dues collected from members. So, of course, they don't want to lose a member, but also ideologically, these police unions have become a reservoir for often extremely conservative, authoritarian worldviews that comport with this idea of, increasing police headcounts is crucial. So they construct a series of ideological arguments that say, without intensive and invasive policing, civilization will collapse. And we can't give an inch on any front. The barbarians are at the gate, and so when we allow those narratives to be taken at face value and not as political projects to keep dues money coming in, then we allow in these voices that are incredibly misleading, that engage in fear mongering, that threaten to withhold what they deem to be essential services when people disagree with them, look at them funny, challenge their legitimacy in any way. So these are really kind of unprincipled actors in the conversation.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I mean, no, I've forgotten what I was going to say. I'm not going to lie. So, I mean, yeah, no, sorry. It comes back. What it comes back to, right, is exactly what we just spoke about at the beginning, which is serious crime. And whether the police actually address this, because if they don't, then that kind of pulls the rug out from under these arguments, and you discussed a whole range of evidence that they don't. But I do find it difficult. I mean, I'm sure you'll have some thoughts on this rhetorically. It is tricky because I think if you say to somebody, "Let's have no police," what they immediately think is, let's have no law and order, let's have lots of crimes, everyone can just kill each other, it's going to be like the Purge, but all year round. How do you deal with those kinds of arguments, which I think are so common?
Sure. So first of all other things being equal, it's obvious that the existence of some form of policing provides a certain level of kind of protective overview. So certain kinds of predatory behavior is undoubtedly deferred, deterred, unimagined because we have this thing called policing that is available. But does that mean that there's no other possible way of addressing the drivers of that predatory behavior? Not to mention all other kinds of potentially harmful behavior. So the next thing is, policing only deals with, at best, a small sliver of harmful behavior. It doesn't do anything about predatory lending practices. Doesn't do anything about corporations polluting the environment in ways that kill many more people than homicides do. It doesn't deal with faulty products. It doesn't deal with climate change. It doesn't deal with landlords that evict people improperly. It doesn't deal with wage theft by employers that drive people into poverty, right? So we've only defined a narrow sliver of things as violent crime to be managed by policing. And if we were really concerned about the overall well-being, especially of communities of color and poor communities, we would actually want to do something about those other problems. There's a whole nother, I don't want to kind of wish away the problem or define away the problem. So we have violent crime. Now, violent crime takes a lot of different forms. It's not one thing. And this is one of the weaknesses of policing. is it's like, well, violent crime is just, no matter what it is, that's for the police to deal with. Are we talking about violence within households between intimate partners? Are we talking about serial killers? Are we talking about organized criminality? Are we talking about beefs that escalate between people who know each other in the community? You know, violence is a lot of different things, and we need strategies that are tailored to addressing each of those specific things. And that doesn't mean that tomorrow there's somehow magically going to be no police and then we'll figure it out.
Yeah.
Right? There is no such magic switch. I don't have the power to make that happen. There's no city council or mayor who's going to eliminate their police force tomorrow and then we figure it out. This is about a process that's playing out over time of investing in new infrastructures of public safety, family support centers, crisis response teams, youth workers, that begin to address what's driving all the violence and begin to develop relationships with people, begin to address past traumas that contribute to a cycle of violence. And as we develop these new infrastructures, we can pull back on policing. We can take some of those savings from policing and reinvest them into more community-based, evidence-oriented, evidence-based strategies. And this is how we make a dent in the issue. And this is what we see happening in a place like Newark, New Jersey. They're literally doing this. It's working. They're extremely happy with it. This is a place that has a long history of violence, of high levels of violence, and they're trying to work it out. They understand that relying on the police to fix this for them has not worked.
It is a really interesting data point, isn't it? I mean, maybe it's slightly simplistic, but you know, if you point out that the police have existed for quite a while, and yet a lot of these problems like haven't gone away, have they? Right. So for it to be your first port of call to say, oh, well, we need the police, it's like, well, I don't know. If they were that great at it, then maybe these problems would be much smaller than they actually are.
When crime goes down, they say, that's proof we need more police because things are out of control. And then, when crime goes down, they say, see, that's proof that policing works. So we got to keep investing in policing. When crime goes up, they say, crime is out of control, therefore we need more police, right?
Yeah.
Every empirical data point is another argument for more policing.
Yeah, that's really true. That's really true. So let's talk, because at the beginning I mentioned legalization and decriminalization, and I also mentioned the getting police out of spaces they shouldn't be in. We kind of discussed the second one in the UK, but I'm just wondering about some of your opinions on things like drug legalization. I mean, do you have a kind of, you do have a
well, look, the UK had legalized medical distribution of opioids for a good bit of the first half of the 20th century.
Yeah.
And it was extremely successful. Overdoses collapse, people go back to work, petty crime is reduced, people don't develop secondary infections, people quit using, they use less. When they know they have a regular supply, when they know it's not full of fentanyl, they don't have overdoses, right? So why did they get rid of it? Because of diplomatic pressure by the United States. It interfered with their war on drugs messaging, and they used international treaties to force the UK to give that system up. And that gave rise to an epidemic of overdoses, right? So we have evidence, the legalization of marijuana has not led to, raping and pillaging in the streets, kids smoking marijuana in classrooms, which was happening before anyway.
Yeah.
Portugal's decriminalization of all drugs, it's fine. Civilization did not collapse. It's working. Public health outcomes have improved. I was in Portugal this summer. It turns out to be a very nice place to visit. I recommend it.
Yeah. Yeah, it was interesting. So what exactly happened in Portugal? Fill us in, because I know a little bit about it, but have they decriminalized all recreational drugs now? Is that right?
Yes, they've decriminalized all drugs and basically turned the problem over to public health authorities. So if police, for instance, do find themselves in a situation where they encounter someone who maybe is intoxicated with drugs or causing a public disturbance, they do not take them to the jail, right? They take them to a public health space. And they say, or perhaps they process them through the jail, but the ultimate outcome of that is we need you to go and engage these public health resources. But there is fairly open drug dealing on the streets in Lisbon. I did see it, but I was there with my children. It was not a problem. There's no violence associated with it, and there was before, much more
Yeah.
so before. And as we create, for instance, safer consumption facilities where people can use drugs with medical supervision, that means less street using of drugs, fewer overdoses, more chances for people to get into treatment. Portugal had the highest HIV transmission rates in Europe before this. And since implementing this, those numbers have collapsed.
Mm. Wow.
They have fewer overdoses, fewer secondary infections. This is working. Is it a panacea? Did everyone, turn their lives around and become perfect, productive citizens? No. But the results are better.
Mm.
And we don't have all the negatives that come with having the police management. And even the police agree with this in Portugal.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, instead of sort of arresting people for, low-level petty offences and harassing people in the street, they presumably can do something that they prefer to do with their working time, right?
Yeah, let's just get rid of the narcotics units.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I mean, it's
They're a
interesting.
huge source of violence, corruption. We just had a major piece in the newspapers here in New York this morning about body cameras capturing police planting drugs on people so that they could make easy arrests.
I mean, yeah, it's absolutely outrageous, isn't it? I mean, and you mentioned the war on drugs, right? And because the war on drugs is quite a US thing, while drugs have been illegal everywhere else. I think to call it a war is kind of accurate in the US. It really has been. And it reminded me of a quote which goes back to what you were saying about managing problematic populations, because I can't remember who it was, but it was somebody in Nixon's administration who essentially admitted that there were two people that were causing them problems in the 60s. It was hippies and African Americans, and they basically said, well, okay, those groups use certain drugs. If we turn those drugs into the enemy, and I think it's weed specifically and crack cocaine, right? That were eventually turned into the enemy.
This is before crack. So
this is before
it's
crack.
heroin.
Yeah. It's heroin, right? Weed and heroin, right?
LSD, yeah.
Yeah. Okay. But that was the official. I don't know if you remember who it was, but they essentially admitted this.
It was John Ehrlichman, who was Nixon's chief domestic policy advisor, who eventually goes to prison as part of the Watergate cover-up. But others have since come forward. Other people who were part of the Nixon administration. So this is well documented. Nixon's own advisors on drug policy favored things like legalization and harm reduction because that's what the evidence shows works. But Nixon wasn't interested in saving lives, producing public safety or public health. He was interested in political power. And he realized that he could use the drug war to both directly punish his political enemies, but more importantly, really, was to signal white voters that in the wake of the victories of the civil rights movement, ushered in by the Democratic Party, that the Republicans were going to be the home of racism in America. And they were going to carry this out not by bringing back legal segregation, but by carrying out a war on crime through drug enforcement, which was the way that the federal government could get involved in what had historically been an almost entirely state matter. They said, well, drugs cross international and state borders, therefore it's a federal issue. So Nixon creates the Drug Enforcement Agency, ramps up federal drug penalties, mostly just signals this idea that the way we're going to micromanage the lives of Black people in the US is not going to be through legal segregation, it's going to be through policing of drugs.
I mean, yeah, so that kind of gives me a chance to ask you a little bit about recent events, right? So the book came out in 2017, which was 3 years after Black Lives Matter first appeared, if I'm right. But also 3 years before it, the most recent outbreak of protests during COVID, which in a lot of ways felt much more culturally and politically impactful. That wave of protests, and I'm wondering, presumably this book has kind of exceeded your expectations in terms of how it's done. Unless you were pretty confident going in, I'm guessing you didn't necessarily expect it to be this big.
No.
How do you feel about its role in like the modern Black Lives Matter movement, and
Yeah.
that which is a response to policies like Nixon's ones that we just spoke about, right?
Yeah, it's been an interesting 5 years for me. So I had the deal with Verso Books to do this before even the uprising in Ferguson, Missouri.
Oh,
So there had been the Trayvon Martin killing that gave birth to the Black Lives Matter slogan. So there was a little bit of stuff happening, the Jenna 6 thing, but it was not, the politics weren't clear. It wasn't clearly abolitionist oriented. There were some really interesting, important abolitionist efforts underway, critical resistance, etc. But these were fairly small scale, somewhat isolated. There was no national movement, etc. So, Verso and we were thinking, oh well, if we can sell 5 or 10,000 copies, that would be amazing. That would be great. And there was this discourse about mass incarceration and some abolitionist ideas there coming out of Angela Davis and Ruth Wilson Gilmore and others, but it hadn't really translated into policing. So I said, let me play this out in relationship to policing, and we'll just throw it in the mix. So it did well when it came out. I mean, we sold our 10,000 copies. And I did a lot of barnstorming, going around the country, talking to people, doing a lot of media, and it definitely found an audience. But then in 2020, it became a bestseller, national media attention. It's now available in 6 languages. So it's we couldn't print the books fast enough in 2020, so we gave out around 100,000 free electronic copies. So
wow.
it is out there. Yeah, I mean, we've sold about 100,000 copies.
Yeah.
So it's far exceeded anybody's expectations.
And I mean, you spoke a little bit at the beginning about, and you've spoken throughout about some of the attempts to put these practices, put these policies into practice. Do you see the defund the police movement as being a kind of quite successful movement? Do you think that the ideas are spreading and that it's going to gain traction?
So I would say that the uprising in 2020 was quite remarkable, incredibly powerful, and added an entire new analysis to policing that had been largely absent in terms of any kind of national conversation, right? Before 2020, the conversation was, do we let the police do what they need to do without restriction, or do we have some superficial police reform? That was the conversation. And that movement added a third element to that conversation, which is what could we do instead of policing to make communities safe? And it has continued to have tremendous resonance. And there are campaigns, grassroots organizing campaigns underway all across the United States to this day, trying to get the police out of the school, trying to get a mental health crisis team created, trying to get support, for community-based violence reduction, trying to shift budget spending in very concrete ways, trying to invest more in harm reduction instead of narcotics units. So is it taking the form of mass multiracial street protests that are blocking highways and bridges? No, that we don't have that mass mobilization, but the day-to-day grassroots organizing is happening. We're seeing people being elected to office on an abolitionist platform. In Los Angeles last month, the city controller, an important citywide elected position, the guy who won election, Ken Mejia, ran as an abolitionist and got more votes than any of the candidates for mayor got. As did some members of the city council run as abolitionists. So, and this is happening in many places. So this is a viable politics at the local level. We are seeing real policy wins. Where it is not showing signs of successes at the federal level. The horse race between the Democrats and the Republicans for control of the federal government is largely, uninterested in these ideas and remains very pro-police. So we need to keep winning victories at the local level, which is where policing happens and where it's funded, and hopefully that will trickle up.
Mm, mm. I have one more question for you, and I added this one because I actually listened to a debate you had a few years ago. What's your view? And you can answer for as long or as short as you want, depending on how long you've got. What's your view of the work of people like Heather McDonald, who basically argue that there isn't any institutional racism in the police, and the problem is that there's basically under-policing, and the police are maybe even too scared to go into certain areas, certainly in the US, and address the horrible violent crimes that are happening there.
Yeah. So as I mentioned, there are these three perspectives that exist around policing. A kind of abolitionist defund the police perspective, a proceduralist police reform perspective, and then a Blue Lives Matter perspective. So Heather McDonald is clearly in that third camp. Police can do nothing wrong, have done nothing wrong. There's no limit to how much we should spend on policing. So this is, of course, an entirely ideological project that is completely divorced from reality. She works at a think tank that is funded by billionaires and hedge fund managers who don't want to pay any taxes. And so it is really important to them to define the problems of America as problems of moral degeneracy that can only be dealt with through repressive policing. Because the alternative would be to tax them to pay for social housing, healthcare for all, better schools, income supports, and all the rest, the things that would actually create safe and healthy communities. So while policing is expensive, it is cheaper than actually fixing our political and economic problems. So to go around denying that there is a problem of race in American policing is ludicrous and frankly, deeply offensive. and insulting to our intelligence. It is a racial project. It is a project of denying the existence of racism so that that racism can continue to function unimpeded, which is what we see, broadly with these attacks on critical race theory and so-called wokeness. My book was used to attack Ketanji Jackson Brown during the Supreme Court nomination hearings in the Senate, though I'm sure she hasn't even read it. Some library that she's associated with had it in the stacks, and therefore, she supports these crazy ideas of race. In other words, that racism exists, it's a problem, and we should try to actually address it. Anyone who says that is merely reinstantiating the legitimacy of race as a concept, which is crazy. Race is a social fact. It exists. It doesn't require that we agree that races are real things. It only requires that we understand how racism operates, which it does.
Yeah, it was. There was Ted Cruz, I think, inadvertently increased your book sales, didn't he, by by bringing up your book? Yeah, I mean,
They had a little bump for a few days.
Yeah. There's they're quite they're quite good endorsements, aren't they? When you get hate from those people. Well, yeah. Thanks so much, Alex. I'll let you get to your class, but this has been really interesting. And again, I must stress I'm not on commission or anything, but like this book is really, really good. Please read The End of Policing. It's really, it goes through everything Alex just spoke about and more. There's loads of really interesting arguments in there that I think need to be heard. So yeah, thank you again.
Well, thank you. That's so lovely.